Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar this morning from Analytical Factory. We're talking about the Phoebe platform this morning. We're talking about capturing and analyzing voice data for emotion insights. We'll introduce the platform in more detail in just a moment, but if you don't know who Analytical Factory are, we're actually a partner organization to Phoebe AI. We're a relatively small organization. And we're all veterans of the analytics, data science, statistical analysis, and software industry, stretching back over the last 30 years. We set up Analytical Factory specifically as a vehicle to deliver the Phoebe platform to market. And we work very closely with the developers of Phoebe, who are former colleagues of ours in the past. So a lot of our customers at the moment are from the research industry, so pretty much market research. We have some customers outside of that, but it is heavily dominated in that area. But bear in mind that that's not the only area where we work. It's not the only sort of vertical within which we tend to use Phoebe. Phoebe is very much all built around voice. It's raison d'etre, if you like, is that voice is still, for most people, the most intuitive, natural, and efficient way for individuals to communicate. So Phoebe is about voice capture and analyzing transcripts of what people are saying and analyzing their tone of voice. Now, as a result of that, it offers multiple ways in which people can capture their audio data and/or video data and send this voice data to Phoebe's own dedicated analysis platform. And we'll touch on at least two of these areas. One is the Phoebe plugin. We're going to talk about that very briefly to begin with. And Phoebe plugin is really designed for individuals who are capturing data usually through some sort of survey form or web form. And they want to voice enable that by adding the Phoebe plugin, which simply allows respondents to record their responses, very often to open-ended questions, rather than typing them in. And this is something which has become quite compelling for individuals, especially when they're working on mobile platforms such as mobile phones. The second area is Phoebe, the Phoebe API platform, where it basically allows us to integrate Phoebe into third-party applications, maybe other sorts of data capture or voice capture applications, where we can access that data and load it onto Phoebe and perform perhaps transcription or emotion detection, which we'll talk about in one moment. And the third area, which is kind of a lot of our customers are working with, is when they already have their own data. They've already got some sort of app, they've already got some sort of channel via which they have perhaps customer feedback or research feedback. It might be in-depth interviews that's been recorded over a platform like Zoom. It might be training sessions. It might be call center recordings. It might be stuff that they've scraped off the internet, maybe TikTok or YouTube. Or it may just be feedback that's been recorded on people's iPhones where they're evaluating a project or through an app or something like that. In any case, they're going to end up with a bunch of files. It might be MP4 files, might be MPEG files, might be AVI files. And they can load these files directly onto the Phoebe platform, which I'll be showing you how to do in just a few moments. So in survey research, Phoebe plugin, we'll talk about that first of all, offers respondents the opportunity to record their answers rather than type them in. I've actually just got a quick recording of me doing that. We'll show you that briefly. But as I say, one of the reasons why people are doing this is, of course, because people tend to give longer answers when they're speaking rather than typing. This is especially true, as you can imagine, when people are typing answers into something like a mobile phone or a smartphone. We find that about 50% of people choose, when given the option, to type rather than record their answer. About 50% will record their answers. This is affected by the device that they're using. They're much more likely to do this if it's a phone than if it's a laptop. And they're more likely to do it if they're younger rather than older. So we're talking about older people who are using a laptop. They're probably more likely just to type their responses. But they have the option, if they wish, even on that platform, to record the answers. And of course, this streamlines the process for a lot of respondents, because talking is faster than typing. They do tend to give longer, richer, more revealing answers. And lastly, of course, we have their answers recorded, so we can listen back to them. We can correct any mistranscriptions, anything that the recording has garbled, and we can actually perform further analysis on it that with regard to their tone of voice. And there is an argument that quite a lot of information is recorded through tone of voice, particularly information related to people's particular emotional state. So as an example of Phoebe plugin, I'll just show you how you can configure Phoebe plugin in a minute, but I'm not going to play all of this recording. I'll play a little bit. If I just click on this, this is just a recording from some time ago of me using Phoebe plugin to fill in a fictional survey. I think it was in a Qualtrics platform. Let's just go back to it. And if I just click here and play this, you'll hear me give an answer.
Long time to gain access.
What would be the most valuable experience we could facilitate at the voice research next time? Please list as many ideas as you'd like.
I'd like to have more time to talk to some of the speakers, as well as the opportunity to play with some of the software tools.
So you can see on those recordings there that I'm giving my answers. It's transcribing them in real time and automatically jumping to the next question. You can actually have a lot of control with the Phoebe plugin over how you want the plugin to behave. You can see that the plugins it's actually configurable down here. I'm just seeing if I can scroll along here to find an actual
as well as the
answer.
opportunity to play with some of the software tools.
So you can see it there being transcribed. It's automatically jumping. And that transcription will, of course, go on to that survey platform, but it'll also be a transcription that will go on to the Phoebe portal platform where we can do further analysis on it. The Phoebe plugin itself is configurable. So if I click on this little plugin link here, you can see that people have a number of different platforms they can choose from. We're adding to this list at all times. A lot of the platforms we're dealing with are actually custom platforms because a lot of research agencies will have their own survey platforms, and we will write a custom script for them if they want to use Phoebe. And you can see that we have control over the response type, whether it's audio or video, or whether the respondent wants to select. We have control over the minimum answer length, or how long the answer length should be, but before it automatically cuts off in case people forget that they're recording and wander away. We can hide the text box. We can allow them to play back their recording if they want to hear it. They can allow them to re-record. We can disable real-time transcription so they can't see what's actually being transcribed. We can perform motion detection. We can automatically translate to English. And we can have a list of questions that we want to use and questions that we want to exclude. Once we've made these selections, it's basically going to generate the script for us, which we would then copy and paste into the survey HTML. And that would basically allow the Phoebe plugin to pop up when people are actually answering their questions. So that's just one method by which we capture data on the Phoebe platform. And it's a very common method that people work with. Some people are really just interested in using the Phoebe plugin. They're not really interested in doing anything else. They just want the transcription capabilities, and they're doing survey research. Other people, as I say, already have data that they've collected through some other means. In either case, that data is going to end up on the Phoebe platform at some stage, and the Phoebe platform, where we analyze it, is called Phoebe Portal. That's of course just a web page. And what Phoebe Portal is doing is it's governing the transcription, it's governing the translation of voices and of recordings, and it's also performing an analysis on tone of voice, which categorizes people into different emotional states. So unlike text analytics platforms, Phoebe Portal's not so much interested in the sentiment of people's words, but rather more interested in their tone of voice and how they're speaking. And in doing so, of course, it's going to create new data that didn't exist before, because it's going to create data around people's emotional state. It's going to say whether or not somebody was, upbeat or happy, or whether or not they were downbeat or sad when they when they uttered a certain phrase at a certain point in time, and it's going to give us numbers that we can do further analysis on. The background to that type of analytics is fairly deep and rich. It goes back certainly over the past 30 years. You'll find a lot of different papers out there on what we call speech emotion recognition. The one that I found probably the most useful when explaining to people how it works is this one here, an ongoing review of speech emotion recognition, which basically goes through all of the different data sets and all of the different publicly available data sets, all of the different methods that people have used over the past 30 years, and all of the different machine learning algorithms that people have used from basic statistical approaches and cluster analysis through to more sophisticated deep learning and recurrent neural networks to try and classify people's tone of voice into different emotional states. And for us, that basically means that when we upload audio data to the Phoebe platform, it treats that audio data just as if it was any other form of a data set. And given our background in data science, we're pretty used to this. And we've done a lot of work in this area. I've certainly done a lot of work in things like classification, algorithms, and predicting and forecasting and generative AI. So here we have some sort of signal, some sort of data that's been given to an algorithm. And what it's going to do from that data is it's going to extract features from it. So it's going to extract measures that it can work with. And it's going to weight features, it's going to say how important they are. And it's then going to use them to classify or categorize people into different emotional states. And the model that Phoebe uses is one that's it's probably one of the most classic models, as you see here, referenced in recognizing emotion and human emotions in speech in 2010. And it uses features such as speech rate and voice pitch and intensity and voice quality and emphasis. It can look at, for example, the words between the gaps between words to see if people are speaking faster or slower. It can see whether or not they're getting louder or quieter, whether or not the pitch is going up. It can detect their articulation, and it uses that to classify or categorize people into five standard states. One is strong. That's probably pretty straightforward. One that is just with people are speaking faster, more passionately, with more emphasis and louder, versus say calm, which is in many ways the opposite of that. It's where people are speaking in a very even tone where the speed isn't changing. We have happy, which is kind of more upbeat, and we have sad, where people are speaking in more downbeat, and we have anxious, where people are speaking in a more breathy, more irregular voicing. And that can indicate, for example, anxiety or concern or worry or potentially excitement, depending on the context associated with that. So our first example that we used here, when we first started out in using Phoebe and demonstrating it to people, we were somewhat hampered with regard to the data that we could show people, because obviously a lot of it's going to be confidential. So we just went and collected our own data. We did a little survey among friends and families where we thought of a subject that everybody has an opinion about, and that's food. So we did a little survey of family and friends called the survey Food Hef. Was that special? What was the worst thing you've ever eaten? And how did that happen? And if you walked into the restaurant of your dreams, what would you order and why? Okay, so if we do that, what we were interested in with regard to the voice responses they gave is where the sentiment contradicted the emotional cadence. So that's when people said really negative things, but said it in an upbeat fashion, or vice versa. We're also interested in which topics would elicit the most passionate responses, and also how childhood memories and feelings of disgust or delight would manifest themselves as emotional categories. So let's take a look at that. If I jump out to the Phoebe portal platform, you can see I'm already logged in here in the background. And this is our web page for Analytical Factory. So every user Phoebe gets their own URL, links to their projects. You can see there's a big plus sign here. You can see I've got the Food Heaven versus Food Hell project. I've got other projects I can use to demonstrate different aspects of Phoebe with. And I've got a big plus sign that allows me to add recordings to an existing project. I'll just quickly show you that before I go into Food Heaven, Food Hell. I've got a little project here, which is just basically labeled famous, which is my test area. And if I had my own recordings, my own video files, my own audio files, and I had a collection of them, I could just do that myself. You don't need to come to Analytical Factory to do that. A lot of our customers are self-serving. They can just go to choose files here. And if I ask it to search for, I don't know, an MP3 file or something like that. You can see there's one here from Simon Pegg and an interview here with Jamie Dornan. If I click open at that point, it automatically detects the language. And it does that pretty accurately most of the time. I could explicitly tell it what language they're speaking. And you can see that there's a lot of languages here. There's actually over 140 different languages here that I could work with. If I just look for English, I could say this person's going to be speaking English. But so I could rather than take the risk of having automatically detect the language, it will do it. I can do it explicitly. And if I hit create at that point, it starts to load or the files into the Phoebe portal at that point. And then it gives me a menu of options. It says, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to transcribe it? Do you want me to identify the different speakers in there? So if there's more than one speaker, it'll speaker one, speaker two. It's very useful, of course, if you've got an interviewer. Do you want me to perform emotion detection? Do you want me to translate it to English? I can choose these different options. And it tells me how many credits, because the processing and the costs are based on the credit consumption. It's basically the number of seconds that I'm going to elapse to process that data. Not on the size of the file, but rather on the time. And also they sent me, if necessary, an email when it's finished doing that. And when it has finished doing that, I'm going to see the transcriptions appear within the project folder, and I'll be able to listen to the recordings, and I'll be able to do some analysis on their tone of voice. So we're going back to the example we mentioned earlier on, which is the Food Heaven, Food Hell survey. In that case, it was collected through the Phoebe plugin, and it just automatically, of course, created these different records for us and give us a respondent ID on the side here. And what we're seeing initially here is just the initial preview of the transcript, so we can see what questions are being answered. The question is, what's the thing you've ever eaten, restaurant of your dreams, etc. You can add in your extra additional fields. So here I've added in a field to indicate whether or not they're male or female. That might be important. You might have a field indicating which territory or which customer segment or which product it is that they're evaluating. I've created a field here called demo, where I can just filter out the cases I don't use in my demonstration. And I can choose my first example here, which is just my friend Alex talking about what's the worst thing she's ever eaten. And she says oysters. I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat. Now, what's interesting here is that we have a speaker identified. This says speaker one. I can't see any other speakers there. I could, if necessary, specify her name. And if there was more than one person speaking, I could say this person is the interviewer. Why would I do that? Well, I don't necessarily want to perform analyses on the interviewers. So I don't necessarily want to do motion analysis on their tone of voice. I'm really interested in respondent. So identifying somebody as an interviewer means that they wouldn't be included in the analysis. Here we've only got one person. I can add their name or I cannot. I can leave it as it is. So here's Alex, and we can see that there's some emotion scores across the top here. And what happens is that Phoebe applies the emotion detection engine in every 3 seconds of speech. And 3 seconds is a pretty good length of time to use, because people can actually say a lot in 3 seconds. An entire sentence can be expressed in 3 seconds. But here she's only spoken for 8 seconds, so it really only gets 2 attempts to do that. And we notice that we're getting happiness and strong emotions, even though the sentiment is clearly very negative. She's saying, oysters, I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat. And if I click on different parts of the transcription, you'll see that the emotion categories take account. We can see where the scoring has occurred. Now I click on oysters here. You can see that's where the strong part is. And if I click on sensation of that thing going down my throat, that's where the happy part is. And if I play it, I can play it back here. I can download it as a MP3 if I want. I can see the transcription with the emotions overlaid on top of it. And I can play it back in real time. If I play it back in real time, you'll hear why it has applied these emotion categories, these tone of voice categories to that particular snippet of speech.
Oysters. I just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat.
So she doesn't just say oysters, she says oysters.
Oysters.
And that emphasis, that emphatic emphasis is most strongly associated with the strong or the passionate category. And then as she starts speaking, she starts to
I
laugh.
just hate the sensation of that thing going down my throat.
So this is how we can start to make sense of the tone of voice that is being detected. And later on, I'll show you how we can isolate the topics that they're talking about and then compare tone of voice from one topic to the next. But that's on the same theme here, exploring this theme. Let's just look at another example. Again, it's Alex speaking, and it's the opposite situation. The situation here is opposite because here she's talking about a very happy memory. But as we can see that the memory actually is dominated by a sad or more downbeat tone of voice. This was recorded during, I think, during the pandemic or in those years, and during that time, she hadn't been home for a while. And we wouldn't necessarily say that her tone of voice here is sad in the sense that it's depressive or anything like that, but we certainly might indicate that it's wistful, that it's nostalgic, and we can see that it starts off quite quite calm, etc. But if we play it back, you'll hear why it's classified it into these categories.
Warm hot chocolate on rainy days. Because always when it was raining a lot in my childhood, my mom would make warm cakes for us, and I love it, and I try to make it for my kids too nowadays when it's raining.
So that slight declination of her tone of voice as the pitch drops starts to mean that she's more strongly associated with the sad category than the upbeat.
Warm cakes for us, and I love it, and I try to make it for my kids too nowadays when it's raining.
So that's often associated with memory and with people being quite contemplative. If we look at an opposite situation to that, we've got, I think this is actually my sister. She's talking about sandwiches, and here she's really blissing out talking about sandwiches. Starts off a little bit nervous.
Okay, so the restaurant of my dreams is pretty much up and down the high street. It's not of dreams. It's not some big fancy restaurant or doing cordon bleu food or anything like that. My husband and I have this chat about what would you have as your death row meal, your last meal that you could have, and mine's is always sandwiches. I think sandwiches are delicious. I love them. I love them in every shape and form. Bread is like my number one enemy and I try and avoid it, but I absolutely love sandwiches. I like food that you could pick at.
So you can see that he's generating very high emotion scores over the 50 seconds of response she's had here. So there's a lot of opportunity for Phoebe to come up with different emotion categories at that stage. Let's look at a couple more here. This is some of the one of the things we were interested in was disgust and how disgust would manifest itself when you've only got these 5 emotion categories. So this one here is a man talking about the worst thing he'd ever eaten. And interesting enough here, we're seeing only combinations of strong and anxious, which seems to be quite strongly associated with disgust.
The worst thing I've ever eaten was actually my mum's pork mince. It was boiled to within an inch of its life. It was bland. It was wet. It was just soggy mince, and it was a poor thing to serve. That was the worst thing I've ever had.
Compared to the same person speaking about what his absolute favorite food was growing up.
When growing up, my favourite food was the Findus crispy pancakes, and the reason was because it was the only thing that my mum didn't crucify. Everything else she used to ruin, but those, she used to sort them out good and proper. And as a hungry lad, used to wolf down loads of them. Loved it.
So you get the idea. This is how we can compare and view and see the emotion categorization in real time. This is how we can view the transcriptions and see the transcription and edit them if necessary. If there's anything in here which is incorrect or been incorrectly transcribed, we can just click on this little edit button here and we can change it. And edit. Sometimes have to do that. We can also do search and replace if it's repeatedly getting a term wrong, which sometimes happens with brands, where the brand name, it doesn't know what that is. And we can do some work around teaching it what brand names are. So it's particularly useful when you're dealing with pharmaceutical research, which leads me to my next example, actually. I wanted to now talk about how we isolate the different topics that people are talking about and how we can do some sort of analysis on comparing how people talk about things. This is known as tagging within data, within Phoebe. And these terms here, these actual variables I'm creating along the side here, where we've got things like the subject or whether we've got males or females, they are in themselves tags in the sense that that response has been tagged as a male speaking, or where they're answering a certain question, or they belong to a certain country or a certain customer segment. So we can do comparison against that. But we can also do comparisons against the actual topics that people are talking about. And the way in which we do that is by using some of these tools across the top here. So one of the first ones I might use, for example, as an illustration here, is to search for a particular word. Now, in the context of this project, this is a survey where people are being asked about pharmaceutical companies, and they're being asked very pointed questions about how they feel about pharmaceutical companies. What good things do they think pharmaceutical companies do? What bad things do they think pharmaceutical companies do? And these are very emotive subjects. These are UK and US respondents. They're often talking about very difficult subjects, talking about their own illnesses and talking about their medication, talking about their families. So it's very emotive in nature. If I search for a term like cure, one might think that that would be a term that would elicit quite positive emotional responses, but in fact the opposite is true. If I click search here, you can see that we're seeing this term being found repeatedly, and not a single one of these responses is showing any real notable scores in the happy category here. A lot of scores, quite strong scores. In the passionate category, a lot of anxiety, a lot of downbeat scores associated with that. And we can see, we can see why that is the case if we actually click on one of them and play the response back.
I really can't think of any good thing that they do because they're in it for profit. I still think that they've got cancer cured, and they just won't release the drug because then they wouldn't have all that research money going.
So you can see for people, this is quite a emotive topic. If I search for the term family, then what you get is a mix. You get people talking in very fond terms about the family, but also people talking about illnesses. And in the same sense, if I search for terms related to money, or to cost or something like that, or insurance and things like that, you'll find that you get a lot of passion starting to appear and a lot of anxiety starting to appear in those terms. So how would we isolate these terms, and how would we start to compare the topics that people are talking about? Well, if I search for the term cost here, I could create a tag. So I could create a tag here, and I could tag that word, or tag the sentence that that word appears within, or the paragraph that word appears within. I could give it a name and attach it to a tag group. And if I do that, I can then create my own tag groups. And if I pick one here, I've got one here called business. If I click business here, and you can see I've got terms related to company and to money and to profit, for example. And that's all under the tag type business. So if we then create a little report of that, we can go to the report section here. I can click on this, and I can say, I want to look at an emotion comparison of the average scores when people mention the term business, and we'll compare and contrast that to when they don't mention it. So I might say, okay, I'm going to split, males and females up or something like that, or I'm going to look at question 1 versus question 2, or the subject area they're talking about broken down by business, and filter that. And that gives me answers to the various subject area, and I can then filter by business. To make it easier, what I'm going to do is just go back to one I've created earlier here. This is family versus business. So here I've got overall, this is the overall response. This is kind of all 200 respondents. We've seen there's a lot of passion here. This is the kind of overall average. And what we find is when we compare groups on an overall level, usually like segment 1 versus segment 2, you often find that things average out, that there isn't necessarily big differences between them if they're being asked to evaluate two different products or something like that, unless the products are really different from one another, they tend to be fairly similar until we start to drill down into the topics that people are talking about. So they're talking about the smell, or they're talking about the colors, or they're talking about aspects of the creative. Here, we're filtering into terms where people are talking about business. And if we look at that, we say only show me when people are talking about business and compare and contrast that. What we see is the strong score starts to get much bigger at that point. So this is something that gets people worked up. It's something that drives more passion. Whereas if we compare this to family, when people mention terms related to family, what we see is things like the happy score gets much stronger now. So that's 0.26, that's 26%, versus the overall score is about 16%. So this is a term that drives a lot more happiness in people, and it means that when we're comparing one group against another, um, or one topic against another, we can start to compare it in terms of the tone of voice, in terms of the emotion and the emotiveness of that particular topic, that particular subject area. So one way in which we can create tags is, as I say, to search for terms, but another way is to use this method here, which is called discovery. And discovery, which I've already run, if I run here, it will actually just run it on the original language or on a translated language. We'll talk about that in a moment. It will translate to English, or even process interviewer text if necessary. But it basically performs an NLP, a natural language processing, and pulls out adjectives, adverbs, nouns. So if I say, just show me the nouns that you found within the transcripts, you can see that terms like people and companies and drugs and money and pharmaceutical getting used. And you can imagine how I might say, right, okay, I'm going to look at when people mention drugs. I'm going to look at when they mention pharmaceutical. I'm going to look at particular types of drugs like painkiller and stuff like that. Medicines, there's a term medicine there. And I can then create a tag group from that. In the same sense, I might say, okay, let's look at adjectives when people are talking about adjectives, and say, okay, when people are talking about worried or different, stuff like that. And I can then start to do comparisons using tags that I created from the discovery method, where it's automatically gone off and found these words for us. And if I do that, I might say, okay, well, let's look at the emotion variation. Here I'm going to look at, say, against adjectives and nouns. Just get rid of that. So here I've said adjectives and nouns. Now I look for like what terms tend to drive really strong reactions, and we'll sort them by order as well. So which ones are quite strong. Price here we can see is higher than average score for price in the strong. And we can see company tends to have more anxiety. Pharmaceutical tends to have more anxiety associated with it. And sadness, we tend to get, worried tends to be more associated with sadness. Health tends to be more associated with sadness. These are the terms that tend to be more downbeat in terms of how people are talking about it. Again, this is one way in which we can start to build up reports and compare one group against another. Now, in all of these examples thus far, this has only been one respondent speaking. We haven't talked about more than one respondent speaking. And we haven't really got two groups that we're comparing one against the other. In the next example I'm going to show you, examples from interviews I've just uploaded from the BBC. And this is using Desertland Disc because they've got a lot of MP3s you can download. And these are long form interviews where people are talking about a lot of different subject areas. I should point out, just before we get to that, actually, I did mention that we can use video data. And, I've grabbed video data off the internet in the past here. So I've looked at, for example, here's a video transcript of a lady who compares two types of cheese. So she literally does blind testing on cheese. And I was very interested to see if there was a difference in the tone of voice between the two different types of cheeses. What she's trying to do is detect which one's the expensive cheese. So if I play that back, I'm just going to play back a little bit of it. I won't play the whole thing, but
see, it's creamier. It doesn't fall apart in the same way. It has this really strong fruity smell. It's just not all about salt and spice the way that typical blue cheese flavor is. So that's kind of confirming my suspicions about cheese B.
So what I've done is I've just gone through the transcripts and just tagged up when she's talking about the cheap cheese and when she's talking about the expensive cheese. And then I've done a little comparison against the two. And it turns out that when she's talking about the cheap cheese, when she's tasting it and describing what she's tasting, she just tends to have much higher scores in the anxiety category than when she's talking about the taste, describing the taste of the expensive cheese, but she tends to have much higher scores in the calm category. I've done a similar thing with football managers when they're talking about when they're giving a post-match interview and just tagged up whether or not they won or lost and looked at the first words they say when they're answering the question, how do you think that went? And what we find out is when they talk about how they think that went, if they've won, they just tend to be much more passionate. And if they've lost, they just tend to be more anxious and just a lot sort of flatter, calm, anxious, quite flatter responses. So it's almost like the adrenaline. It's picking up on the unconscious adrenaline in their speeches. Sometimes when you actually listen to these transcriptions, it's hard to tell from just listening to the tone of voice whether or not they've won or lost because they've all been media trained. So it's a really interesting little experiment to perform. Let's look at the Desert Discs though. Desert Discs, now we have effectively long form interviews. Here's Adele being interviewed. So it's being interviewed by Lauren Laverne. When I uploaded that, I just simply uploaded them as a bunch of MP3 files. And you can see that I've tagged lots of terms along the side here. You can see that I've identified Lauren Laverne as the interviewer, and in doing so, that means that her words are italicized, and it means that her words aren't added to the emotion analytics. But I could click on any one of these sections here. You can see the level of anxiety associated, or the level of strong emotion or happy emotion associated with each of these responses. And I could actually click on text and emotions, and it would show me them overlaid. If they were in different languages, they're not, but if they're in different languages here, we could just toggle back and forth between the non-English language and the English language translation. And if we tag up in the same sense as we did beforehand, where I've searched through the transcripts and listened to them and asked it to create or search for terms, asked it to find words that people are talking about. I've run the discovery here and said, what words are they using? And I look at nouns. They're using words like time. They're using words like people, song, of course, because they're picking songs, life, music, years, school, day. So it's all these the terms. You can imagine the sorts of tag groups I create from that. I'm creating a tag group here. If I look at the tag groups, I've got a group like children. People talking about their children. They're talking about their family. They're talking about themselves, they're talking about schooling and stuff like that. So if I then look at some of the reports I've generated off that, let's look at the overall emotion times when they're talking about school, split by whether or not they're male or female. So here we have 23 female interviewees and 17 female interviewees and 23 male interviewees. This is the overall emotion profile. So there's a mix of emotions here because, of course, people are being asked about their childhood and upbringing, and about their work, about the music that they've chosen and why that's important to them. So you are going to get a mix of emotions. You are going to get a lot of anxiety and concern as people talk about things which concern them or which make them uncomfortable or which make them anxious. But if we isolate those occasions when they talk about school, for example, here, we find that for the male respondents in particular, that tends to give a much stronger response. They tend to have a bigger peak on the strong emotion. For females, it doesn't tend to make much of a difference. So going back and forth, we can start to compare one against the other. So we can see the spike in school when the male respondents are talking about their schooling as they're coming up. So that's an interesting subject area. In a similar sense, we can talk about family. When people are talking about family, again, this is the overall emotion we're talking about. Here's the female emotion here. You can see it's about 10%. These add to 100%. So that's effectively 0.10, 10.8%. For males in the happy category here, it's 28%. If we isolate those occasions when they talk about family, we can see that for the males, they're suddenly a lot more anxious. And for the females, a lot more anxious. So, this is a topic which drives a lot of anxiety in people. If we talk about work, Again, look at the male response here, 28%, much happier when talking about, well, slightly more happy talking about work than females. Females, 10% on the sad group. We talk about working, the term working. We see that the male score jumps to 35% on the happy, upbeat tone of voice, and the female score jumps to 23% on the sad or more downbeat tone of voice. So these are very interesting, very emotive topics. And again, we can do analysis on nouns that they're using and try to find out, what words are strongly associated with strong emotions. And it's telling me that, these are quite small numbers here, but if we scroll down through them, we can see some of these, like 11% more anxious when talking about parent, for example, here. You know, and what's a 16% more strong when talking about film, well, a lot of them are actors in here, etc., etc. We do the same thing with adjectives. All of these charts that we're producing here can be exported. You can download them as CSV files. And in doing so, you can just create your own charts from the back of it, perhaps in something like Excel or Microsoft Office if you so wanted. Now, something that we've recently introduced into Phoebe is effectively generative AI. So you can see here that if I just go back to Deseret Disk project, you'll see subtly down here in the corner this little symbol, this icon of a head. If I click on that, you can see I've got responses to questions that I've asked Phoebe using effectively like a Phoebe Copilot. If I ask one of these questions, like what are the top 15 most common subject areas interviewees discussed in the database? So this helps me develop tags, and it helps me, find out what sort of subject areas I might want to create tags from. You can also see here it says the database contains interviewees from a podcast, act as a qualitative researcher interested in how tone of voice relates to spoken subject matter. So if I just copied that now and ran it again, it wouldn't give me exactly the same answer because that's how generative AI works. There's a slightly random element to it. But I could do that. And while it's thinking about that, it would go off and think about that. We'd just jump back out to the slides and we'll see the response I got earlier on. And you can see it's, this is what people talk about in Deseret Disk. They talk about overcoming adversity and building resilience. They talk about, if they're scientists, scientific discovery and exploration, the joys and challenges of creative pursuits. It does give me some help with regard to, what's driving some of the emotion scores. And it says, things like discussions on one's identity, finding places. High, happy, and strong scores relate to themes of optimism and aspiration. Lower scores in happy alongside higher scores in sad and anxious when people talk about personal loss and grief. Childhood memories and influences, including happy scores and sad scores, and indicating the complex ways in which the past shapes individuals. So this is quite useful because it helps me then start to think about, what types of topics should I be tagging up here, when I'm trying to compare one group against another, and I'm trying to isolate the subject matter that people are mentioning. Plus, of course, particularly with long form interviews, it's just a very nice way for me to summarize what the people are actually talking about and allow me to interrogate the data in terms of just simply the subject matter that they're mentioning. Okay, so I think that's all we have to show with regard to demonstration of the Phoebe platform. You should be aware that Phoebe does support more than 145 different languages and dialects, including Chinese, Japanese, and Arabic languages. It provides transcription in the native language. It provides translation to English and emotion detection. And both the transcription and translation functions provide at least one alternative AI model to execute the process. So you can actually use more than one model. If you're finding that, for example, if you're working with Japanese transcripts that the transcription is somewhat garbled, there is another way. There's another button you can press to say, okay, try this alternative model. For surveys, the language questions are asked. The language questions asked and are actually controlled by the settings of the survey platform. How are our clients currently making use of Phoebe Portal? Well, some of them are comparing reactions to products and promotions across different groups. You can see here that I've actually downloaded the data from one of the charts. This is a CSV file, and I've recreated the chart in Excel. Some of them are analyzing in-depth interviews of multiple speakers. and they're creating transcripts of that and exporting them as PDF. Some are creating sizzle reels. We actually have a little facility here within Phoebe where we can go off and look at video responses. Let's see if I can find this with some video data here. We have the cheese data. You can see I've got this little tool here where I can say I want to create a little video, and I could then create a video of tag terms of when every time somebody mentions, I don't know, color or mentions texture or something like that when they're evaluating a product. And it just helps bring the any presentation that we're working with to life. We can bulk download the videos as well. And we can create summary reports and charts using project-specific filters and selections. There are other types of charts here I haven't talked about, things like word clouds, where we can see what words pop with different emotion categories, like important here being, of course, as we might expect, being a word which is spoken with great emphasis in the strong emotion category. So in summary, the Phoebe platform consists of the plugin, which allows us to capture the data through by voice enabling a web survey. We have the portal, which allows us to directly upload data and to perform analysis on it. And we have the API platform, which allows us to plug into existing capture systems or any audio systems or video systems that people might have in order to ingest that data directly into the Phoebe portal platform and perform further analysis within that. I do hope you find that useful. You may find more resources on our website, including FAQs and videos and examples that we haven't had a chance to include here today. But if you do have any further questions or you want to discuss this, best thing to do is just drop us a line. Just give us a call or drop us an email, and we'll be happy to set up perhaps a custom demo for you or discuss your project, the pricing options, and how Phoebe might be used in any forthcoming engagements that you have. In the meantime, thanks for logging in, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.